The man who saved me looked at me as if every breath I took was a mistake. There was no compassion in his face, no rush to get me out of there. Only a restrained, cold tension, as if he were about to do something against his own will. And maybe he was. His name was Liam, but that night when our lives collided, he was just a shadow armed with silence and rage. I, still dazed, dirty, my wrists marked by the ropes that had bound me for days, looked at this man as if he were my last chance, and at the same time, my judgment, because he hated me, and he made no effort to hide it. Not with words, but with every restrained gesture, with the way he avoided touching me when he could, as if my skin burned. He was the kind of man who had already lost everything and stood tall, not out of faith, but defiance. And yet he came. He pulled me out of hell. Not for me, but for a reason he wouldn't yet say. And I was the princess, the senator's daughter, the heir to the Callahan family, a symbol of tradition, power, and national pride, the kind of woman who should be at charity galas in a fitted dress, with a ready smile and a memorized speech. Not in this situation, not beside him. But the truth is, in that moment all the masks I'd been dressed in since birth had fallen away. I wasn't Helena, the hope of the clan. I was just a wounded woman, facing the weight of carrying a name that had destroyed lives, including his. And the cruelest part is that I knew who he was. I knew what my father had done. I knew there was dried blood between us, and still, I went with him, because something in that man's eyes, even hardened as they were, told me he would bring me back. That for some reason, even he didn't understand. He still cared enough not to leave me behind. And that first night, in silence, I was forced to accept the most uncomfortable truth of my life. I owed my survival to the man who had every reason to let me die. For the first few hours, we didn't exchange a single word. He drove as if carrying a bomb in the passenger seat, rigid, alert, eyes fixed on the road, fingers steady on the wheel. I, curled up, watched his profile through the fogged-up window, searching for a flaw, a crack in that steel mask. But Liam was a fortress. Every movement seemed calculated, as if speaking were a waste of energy, or worse, a concession he wasn't willing to make. And I understood. More than I wanted to. Because there, between the dried blood on my ankles and the scratches on my face, was a part of me that didn't want to speak either, that preferred silence to the shame of admitting that for the first time in my life, I was completely defenseless. And worse, dependent on someone my family had destroyed. Slowly, the silence became as sharp as any accusation. Every stop, every quick glance in the rearview mirror was a minefield. And when he finally spoke, it was with a hoarse, low voice, like someone addressing an enemy but needing to give an order to stay alive. "Are you hurt?" I took a second to respond, maybe surprised that he cared. "I'm fine," I lied. He just nodded without looking back, and the silence returned, heavier than before. That simple, curt, almost mechanical question was the first crack in the barrier between us, and somehow it affected me more than it should have. At night we stopped at an abandoned gas station, and he tossed a blanket at me without a word. As I covered myself in the back seat, pretending to sleep, I heard him turn on a small radio and stare into nothingness for hours. The cabin light cast shadows on his face, and for a moment I saw the exhaustion. Not the physical kind, but the other. The kind that comes from someone who no longer expects redemption. And I wondered, what does he see when he looks at me? Am I just the daughter of the man who ruined his life? Or am I, in that moment, just another open wound he refuses to face? Strangely, I began to wish he'd see me as a person, not a symbol, not an heir, but just Helena. It was in that early morning that, for the first time, I felt something beyond fear. It was discomfort, yes, but also curiosity. Who was this man? Why did he come to rescue me with so much contempt in his gaze? What lay behind that tightly controlled anger? Maybe deep down, I wanted him to hate me less, or to explain why. But all I got was the cold night breeze slipping through the half-open window, and the sound of my own pride keeping me awake. On the third night, everything changed. Not explosively, but with a kind of clarity that creeps in slowly, like realizing you're no longer the same person you were 2 days ago. We were running from something bigger than just the kidnappers. We were fleeing exposure, the media's interests, the political alliances my father maneuvered with invisible strings. But we were also fleeing each other. Liam still kept his distance, but there was something new in the way he looked at me. Something that wasn't quite compassion, but wasn't contempt anymore either. Maybe it was recognition, as if he were finally seeing that behind the polished facade, there was someone there, tired, hurt, and trying to understand where it all went wrong. That night, we slept in the car again, at an isolated gas station, but I couldn't close my eyes. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was cruel. I needed to break it. So I spoke. I whispered in the dark, without looking at him. My father destroyed your life, not mine. He didn't respond right away, but his body tensed. I continued. You hate me for something I didn't do. The reply came curt, as always. You are what he built. And there it was. The verdict, but also his truth. Then hate me fairly. I shot back, my voice steady, though trembling inside. But know me first. And in that moment the silence didn't return. We stayed there, eyes fixed on the car's ceiling, breaths short, until he murmured, almost to himself, I shouldn't have come. Maybe that was the most honesty he could give me. But it was enough, because now I knew there was doubt within his anger. And where there's doubt, there's space. The man who hated me could no longer sustain that hatred with the same conviction. And I was beginning to see that there was something in the depths of his eyes that wasn't hatred. It was pain. It was in that early morning that I understood. Our pasts were at war, but our presents were being forced to coexist. And maybe, despite everything, we were recognizing each other. Not as enemies, but as survivors of the same broken world. The change between us wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. It started with small things. The way Liam began handing me water bottles without looking away, or the more restrained tone he used when speaking to me without the hidden venom. It wasn't kindness yet. It was something rarer. Respect growing through the cracks. During the longer stretches of road, he started asking short, practical questions, but with an attention he hadn't shown before. And for the first time, I answered with the truth, not the rehearsed lines I'd learned since childhood. I spoke of my lonely childhood, the corridors of the mansion where I grew up, where the walls were colder than marble. I spoke of my mother's silence, my father's rigidity, how being Helena Callahan meant smiling in public and staying silent in private. Liam listened, not like someone waiting to contradict, but like someone hearing something they'd never had access to. Sometimes he made short, harsh comments like, you had everything, but there was less venom in them now. And in a moment when the car broke down on a secondary road while we waited for help, we sat side by side on the dry grass, and he finally spoke more than a sentence. He told me his father had served mine with blind loyalty until the day he was accused of espionage, unjustly, according to Liam. A convenient accusation to clean up the image of the campaign my father was leading at the time. His father was dishonored and Liam lost everything, his home, his studies, his name. He'd lived as a shadow since, fueled by a kind of anger that kept him standing but also kept him from living. I learned to exist with a clenched stomach and a closed fist," he said, staring at the ground. "And every time your face appeared on TV, talking about the Callahan Foundation and charity, all I could think was that you didn't know half of it." I couldn't deny it. I didn't apologize. But I didn't defend myself either. I just said I only learned the halves when I grew up. We stayed silent after that, but it was a different silence, not one of confrontation. A silence of pause, as if we were both tired of carrying stories we didn't start but were given as armor. From that day on, the road stopped being an escape. It became a crossing. And as strange as it sounds, beside Liam, I began to feel more alive than I ever had within the walls of my own home. The following days were marked by a strange kind of intimacy, the kind that grows between two people who carry more pain than certainty. Liam and I still clashed, but now there was something stronger between us than the past: recognition. I started noticing his silences, the pauses before he answered, the deep lines between his brows that betrayed an old exhaustion. It wasn't just anger he carried. It was exile, from himself, from the life stolen from him, from the peace he'd never had time to know. And somewhere inside me, I saw myself in him. One night, we stopped at a makeshift cabin, rented by one of his contacts. The journey had stretched over a week, and the road was starting to weigh on our bodies. He insisted I sleep first, but I couldn't. I watched him from across the room, his face resting in his hands, eyes distant. When I approached, he didn't react with the coldness of before. He just said, "You're not to blame for what your father did, but you have a choice in what you do with it." Those words echoed in me like a key turning an inner door I didn't even know existed. That same night, I told him something I'd never told anyone. That since I was a child, I'd been taught to be a symbol, not a person. That I was trained to smile for photos, to measure every word, to become an ambassador of morality while my family negotiated in the shadows. I told him about the day I saw my father destroy a journalist's reputation with a single phone call, just because she asked too much. I told him how I learned to stay silent for survival. And Liam listened, fully, without interrupting. When I finished, he just said, "Now it makes sense." After that, something shifted between us. There was no touch, no vows. But his eyes began to seek mine when we entered a place. His steps began to align with mine. And in a mundane moment, a gas station on the edge of a forgotten road, a man approached me with insistence. Before I could say a word, Liam was between us, his body tense, his gaze alert. When the man backed off, he looked into my eyes for too long. And in that moment, I realized he hated me less. Or maybe he didn't hate me anymore. Maybe now he feared me. Because that's what love is, isn't it? The fear of loss. And I saw that fear in his eyes. We didn't talk about what was growing between us. It was too soon. It was too risky. But in the silence of the road, as he drove and the scenery blurred past the window, I leaned my head against the glass and smiled inside, because without realizing it, I was falling in love with someone who once wanted to hate me, and who was now the only place I felt safe. The line between what we were and what we were becoming broke for good when the threat caught up with us again. We thought we'd left it all behind, the pursuers, the tracks, the fear. But that early morning when we heard the sound of tires skidding on the gravel road and headlights flashing in the rearview mirror, we knew it wasn't over. We were being followed. Liam reacted with instinct and precision, as if born to survive. But I saw something on his face I'd never seen before. Panic. Not for himself. For me. The escape was quick, tense, almost unbearable in a moment of real danger. He pushed me out of the car, ordering me to run down a dark trail while he drew the attention of the armed men. "Go, Helena, now!" he shouted, his voice hoarse, more fear than command. I obeyed. I ran like I'd never run before, stumbling, falling, crying from pain. But I went. Every step in the dark was a knot in my stomach, not from the threat behind me, but from the thought that he might not come back. And when he did return, hours later, with bruised arms, his face scratched by branches, and his eyes heavy with exhaustion, I didn't say anything. I just threw myself against him without thinking. And he held me as if holding something fragile but necessary. We stayed like that for a long time, breathing fast, feeling each other's warmth in silence. Then he gently pushed me away, his eyes on mine, and said, "I thought I'd lost you." That's when I knew. It wasn't doubt or tension or just respect anymore. Liam cared, not just as a man fulfilling a mission, but as someone who had started to see me with his own eyes, not the shadows of the past. And I too, I no longer saw in him the rebel, the exile, the enemy. I saw the man who pulled me from captivity, yes, but also the man who refused to treat me like a fragile princess. The man who challenged me to face myself head on. That night, we shared the silence like a prayer. And without needing to say a single word, we understood we were bound by something greater than inherited grudges. We were building something neither of us had ever had, choice. And though we knew the road back to the city would be a confrontation with everything we'd tried to forget, now there was an us. Returning wasn't heroic. It was a test of endurance. I knew, from the moment I saw the city lights again, that nothing would be the same. Not because of what had happened to me, but because of who I'd become beside him. The streets were the same, the guards at the gate, the anxious aides, the faces feigning relief. But I was no longer the obedient daughter, the living image of my family's publicity campaign. I was someone who had survived not just the kidnapping, but the lie. And now, with Liam by my side, even if at a distance, I could no longer pretend I didn't know the truth. He left me at the corner. He refused to enter the mansion, said he'd already stepped too far where he wasn't welcome. His eyes weren't cold anymore, but resigned, as if he expected this to be the last time. I tried to say something, anything, but the words caught between my throat and fear. Fear that he was right. Fear that now that everything was resolved, they'd expect me to go back to who I was. Inside the house, my mother hugged me tightly. My father kept his composure, but his eyes analyzed every move I made, searching for cracks. The next day, the press was summoned. They wanted me to smile, to say I was fine, to publicly thank the security forces. But they didn't mention Liam, not a word. The man who risked everything for me had been erased, like an inconvenient shadow that didn't fit the perfect narrative. And it was in that moment, facing the cameras, with flashes blinding me and the prepared speeches in my hands, that I understood. Returning was necessary. But staying silent would betray everything I'd lived. And above all, it would betray him. That morning, the rehearsed speech rested in my hands like dead weight. Every word written by someone who wasn't me. Someone who wanted to keep me palatable, useful, controlled. I was seated beside my father, with the press in front of me, microphones on, and the world waiting for me to fit back into the frame. But something in me wouldn't allow that fit anymore. I thought of Liam. His words, his pain, his truths. I thought of how he'd brought me back, not just to my family, but to myself. He had seen me, heard me, and now no one even said his name. I set the paper aside. The microphone trembled under my fingers, but my voice came out steady. I spoke about what I'd lived through, the fear, the captivity, the days of silence, and the rescue. And then I said, I was saved by someone you've chosen to erase. There was a stir in the room. My father stiffened beside me, but he didn't interrupt. I continued. A man named Liam, a man my family condemned years ago, a man who had everything unjustly taken from him and still gave me everything he had. His life, his freedom, his courage. I could hear the shock, the clicks of cameras, but I didn't falter, because I wasn't speaking out of impulse. I was speaking out of conviction. The fallout was immediate. Some media outlets tried to discredit me. Others demanded answers. My father's allies backed off, and he, for the first time in years, was forced to face a truce he couldn't control. For days, we avoided each other. But then he called me to talk. It wasn't an easy conversation. There were no tears or deep reconciliations. But there was silence. And then a sincere question. Do you love him? I didn't hesitate. Yes. He didn't respond. He just nodded like someone who, even without accepting, realizes they've lost a battle, but maybe gained a daughter. In the days that followed, I searched for Liam. He'd vanished. Of course he had. He wasn't the kind of man to wait for the world to do justice, but I knew he'd hear me. So I wrote, not a speech, not a plea, a note, short, true. Come back if you want, but know that this time I'll come for you. And I left it where it all began, on the bench at the train station where our hands first touched after the escape. He came back. Not with flowers, not with promises, but with that same steady gaze as always, only this time without armor. I saw him walking toward me like someone who'd decided he no longer needed to run from anything, not even himself. He sat beside me on the station bench, took the folded note, and tucked it into his jacket pocket like it was something precious. And then he said, "This time, I'll stay if you still want me." My response was a smile that came with held back tears, not from sadness, but from relief. At last, time didn't erase what we lived through, but it didn't trap us in it either. We built a life away from the spotlight, far from the modern palaces that once promised me safety. We discovered that freedom doesn't shout. It whispers in the coffee shared in the morning, in hands that seek each other without haste, in conversations that don't need defenses. I continued my work, but now on my own terms. I founded an E-Date organization with his name in silence, Project 71, the number of the protocol that tried to erase him. And every time a young woman found her own voice there, I knew. We were rebuilding the world from within. Liam never wanted credit. He never sought revenge. His greatest act was staying when it would have been easier to leave, and mine was choosing myself, even when the whole world expected otherwise. Today, when I look at him, there are still scars. There are still days when the past haunts us. But the love, this love born on the edge between pain and choice, is the only home either of us has ever known. And the man who once hated me is the same one who now falls asleep with his head in my lap, at peace. Sometimes I catch myself watching Liam through the window as he tends the garden we planted together. And I'm still amazed at how life brought us here. I never dreamed of a fairy tale ending, and he never believed in them. But there's something deeper in this quiet daily life we've built. It's the kind of happiness that doesn't need an audience. Here, we're neither heirs nor ghosts. We're not the princess and the fallen soldier. We're just us. Scars on display, memories alive, and a tenderness neither of us knew how to explain, only feel. The wound that brought us together hasn't vanished, but now it pulses in sync with a mature love that doesn't need to prove anything. The world moved on. My father never apologized, but he also never tried to shape my steps again. My mother quietly started visiting the house on weekends, bringing pies she swears are just to keep tradition, and when we gather in the garden, Liam treats her with gentle respect, and she with that silent look of a mother who finally understood what true love is. From everything I've lived, I've learned one thing. Sometimes love comes disguised as confrontation, and the person who pulls you from the darkness might also be the one you feared most. But when fear turns into choice, that's where freedom begins.